I've had the good fortune of having Steve as a longtime valued friend, and he needs no introduction. But here's what those of us that know him well think about him. He's one of a kind, very knowledgeable, creative, strong convictions, and he has courage when it comes to those convictions, and he's demonstrated that in the past, to me anyway. He has incredible energy. Those of us that know him don't know, maybe he doesn't even sleep. If you haven't read his hotline, you aren't taking his hotline, I urge you to do it. I think it's one of the most important things he's created.
Well, thank you, Tom. That is incredibly generous. I mean, I'm just so honored to call you a friend. And one of my greatest contributions, by the way, Adam, is I introduced you to Tom Smith, and that's been a great marriage of great minds, and great productive resources. So, Adam, I just want to say I'm a huge admirer. I just have to quickly tell the story of when Adam kept pestering me and pestering getting together. And we, finally I said, okay, we'll get together. And we got together. Remember the Pancake House in Wilmette, Illinois, and we had about an hour breakfast. And Adam was telling me about this new concept about Open the Books, and I thought, wow, this is pretty cool idea. And so you convinced me, and it was because of your dogged determination. And so then I said, I know a guy who I think is going to be really interested in this. And Tom, I called you and said, you got to get to know Adam. And so you guys have done amazing work. And I just want to we use your stuff all the time. And I think it has made a huge difference in terms of how Americans perceive their government. And you've done enormously good work in terms of, not just exposing, how our tax dollars are spent, but forcing these entities that don't want anyone looking under the hood. No, none of these government officials they hate you. They don't want you, looking at how they're spending their money, and it's had a huge impact. So thank you. And Tom, you are a national treasure, and I really appreciate it.
I was the one to talk about. It's one of our first friends at OpenTheBooks. He was our first board advisor, and he did make that introduction to Thomas W. Smith, and that, together, all of us, we've all helped to try to change the world. But I just want to say, Steve is the hardest working economist in the history of finance. It's probably a low bar, but nobody travels more. Nobody does more media. He has more good ideas than Steve Moore. His impacts were recognized last year on the Power 100, the most influential persons in global finance. 32nd on the list was Steve Moore, one notch behind Warren Buffett. So, Steve, thank you. Hats off to you. Thanks for your hard work. Thanks, I just want to highlight two of our most recent investigations. Andrew Cuomo, we investigated whether the New York governor engaged in the highly unethical practice of soliciting state vendors for campaign cash. And it turns out we found since 2014, he solicited 350 state vendors for $6.2 million of campaign cash. And those state vendors had reaped $7 billion from the state treasury. And if Andrew Cuomo is up for attorney general, we think these findings could play a major role in his confirmation hearings. I just want to get to our first question here on the conversation. It's on everybody's mind. Numbers seem to be spiking on the coronavirus pandemic. Biden has forecast a dark winter. So here's the hard question, Steve. Do we need more coronavirus bailouts from Washington, D.C.?
Well, that's a great question. And I would start by saying that, we are learning as we go along from this coronavirus, this 1.5 century pandemic. And the one thing that you would hope that everyone has learned and accepts as just a truism is that lockdowns do not work. Lockdowns do not work. And I remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, I got a call from Tom Smith. And Tom, you may recall, because it had a big impact on my thinking about this, that, Tom called me in some despair, and that's unusual for Tom because he's always so upbeat. He said, "Steve, I'm so worried about our country right now." And and I think you said, Tom, you'd lived through the Depression, World War II, Vietnam War, and the high inflation of the '70s, and you said you'd never been more worried about the future of our country. And I share that concern, and that's one of the reasons I've spent the last year just trying to help get us through this in a sensible way without destroying our economy, but also keeping the American people safe. And so that's a long-winded way of saying that the one lesson we've learned is, and we've done so much research on this, that the states that did not lock down their economies, and it's also true of countries, have actually had better performance in terms of, in terms of lower death rates, lower hospitalization rates, but also they didn't destroy their economies. New York City, and Adam, where you are in the Chicago area, these major cities are, I don't know if they're ever going to come back. I mean, it's incredible the damage that they're doing. New York City is going through another full lockdown. New York City will never be the same again, at least not for the next decade. Chicago is going to take a decade to recover from this. And it's so unfair to the great men and women who build these businesses and put their whole life into it. And then they get these edicts that, force them to lock down their doors. And once you go bankrupt, you can't come back from that. So I'm very worried about this direction of things. I think Biden and Democrats like to shut down. They are lockdown artists. And when Biden's top health advisor says maybe we need a 6-week lockdown of the economy, ladies and gentlemen, that's insane. That's insanity. That would be catastrophic for our country. Even for someone to even mention an idiotic idea like that. And by the way, Adam, you'll love this. You know what he said? He was asked, well, gee, what's that going to do to our economy? He said, it'll be okay. We're just going to print money. We're just going to print $2 or $3 trillion and everything's going to be fine. I mean, this is the kind of economic insanity that we are dealing with in Washington right now. Meanwhile, you've got states like Florida and Texas and Tennessee and Utah that are open for business and, actually are back at full employment. So we cannot lock down, Adam. We cannot lock down our economy. We cannot allow the politicians to do this. And I don't care what these governors and mayors are saying. I am going to celebrate Thanksgiving with my family.
Excellent point. So look, we went back and we looked at the TARP bailouts of the Obama administration back on the Great Recession. And all told, it was less than $1 trillion. We've already thrown at least $4 trillion at coronavirus. So we've already thrown $4 trillion at coronavirus. The HEROES Act is passed in the U.S. House since May. It's been stuck in the Senate, and and the scope of that bill is conditional on the Georgia runoff, whether or not the Republicans hold the Senate. In the HEROES Act, the Democrats have pitched it that they're going to bail out first responders, hospitals, things like that. But what we found this week, and we published more, I did the radio program on WABC on his weekend program, 50 wealthiest places in America stood to reap $350 million worth of coronavirus bailout. The number one most richest place in America is Atherton, California, with an average household income of over $500,000. They would get $4 million of bailout. Scarsdale, right there in New York City, they would get $9 million worth of coronavirus bailout. This today also made a board editorial at the New York Post and a nice write-up. So look, there's a lot of coronavirus bailout dollars. The CARES Act for the 25 wealthiest colleges and universities, they have a collective endowment of $350 billion, a third of $1 trillion worth of endowment. They reaped $1 billion worth of coronavirus bailout out of that March bill that passed. A lot of waste in these publications. It is a target-rich environment, and we're really focused on it. Steve, pre-pandemic, we kind of got ourselves in a pickle with $1 trillion budget deficits, between 2017 and 2019. Pre-pandemic, we were running $1 trillion worth of budget deficit. 2 of those years, Republicans had complete control of Congress and the presidency. What happened?
Well, look, I mean, I think our primary focus, in the early years of the Trump administration were to grow. I think that's what Trumponomics is all about. Grow the economy, get people working, get businesses, profitable and hiring people. And we're really proud of our record there. I mean, you look at what happened in the most recent census report, which is the gold standard of economic reports. We brought about the lowest poverty rate in the history of the United States, which is incredible. Not just for all Americans, Hispanic Americans, female-headed households. The child poverty rate fell to its lowest level ever. I mean, think about that. That means in 2019, a smaller percentage of Americans were poor than at any other time in the history of the United States. We saw massive gains in household income. Household incomes rose to $68,000 a year. We had more income gains, Adam, in 2 years under Trump than in 8 years under Obama. I mean, so something went really wonderfully right with the economy. Now, right about these deficits, and right now, unfortunately, we got neither party's much interested in deficits. The Democrats believe now that in this modern monetary theory, they should just borrow and borrow and borrow and borrow, and there's no cost to that. Well, we know from the history of other countries that that's a story that doesn't have a happy ending. But I predict that you're going to see a massive, request for increased spending if Biden becomes president. By the way, I don't think this race is over. I think there are a lot of votes to count. I think there's a good chance that Trump is going to overtake Biden and potentially Nevada and Arizona, and then it might come down to just one state, like Pennsylvania or Michigan. So it's still doable, and I think people should take some heart in that. And I think Trump is right not to throw in the towel yet, but this is why your work is so important to expose the fraud. I mean, why is it about giving $500 billion in this aid package for a blue state bailout? It's outrageous. Right now, Adam, Texas doesn't have a budget deficit. Tennessee doesn't have a budget deficit. Florida doesn't have a budget deficit. Utah, I was just in Utah. Utah has a budget surplus. So wait a minute, you're going to take money from the states that acted responsibly, and you're going to give it to the money to the states that acted irresponsibly? I just don't see any support for that right now among Republicans. Of course, Democrats they want this blue state bailout. That's why we didn't get a new bailout. And by the way, I got to say kudos to Trump to not caving into Pelosi on this and wasting. She wanted a $3 trillion bill. For $3 trillion, for $2 trillion, as I wrote in the Wall Street Journal, just to give you a sense of how much money they're talking about spending. For $2 trillion, you could completely cancel the personal income tax and the income tax for an entire year. And you'd be spending less money. The deficit would go up by less. Now, is there any rational person who actually believes if we want to stimulate the economy, that it would be better to just pour money on these people rather than to just cancel all the income taxes? Can you imagine how well businesses would do, how much hiring they would do if they didn't have any income tax expenses? So you can tell there's frustration in my voice because sometimes I think we just throw good economics out the window.
But you're right to highlight, back to this coronavirus bailout bill that stuck, this HEROES Act. So everyone remembers in April when the Illinois State Senate President John Harmon wrote a letter to Pelosi requesting a $42 billion bailout of Illinois, and everybody laughed. But guess what? The HEROES Act, we just did the math, state and municipal level bailouts, she allocated $40 billion to Illinois. Everybody laughed when California Governor Gavin Newsom wrote Pelosi a letter asking for $1 trillion 50-state bailout. And that's exactly what's in the HEROES Act. So you take a look at Florida, who has now more people than the state of New York. And we've got a lot of people that live in New York on this call, a lot of East Coasters. Well, New York, with fewer people than Florida, would get about $67 billion out of the HEROES Act at state and city and municipal level bailout. Florida, who's not even asking for a bailout, would get $44 billion. You take a look at San Francisco, Nancy Pelosi's backyard. Most people don't recognize that San Francisco is a city and a county. The city is in for $1.3 billion the county on the same geographic area is in for another $500 million. San Francisco, out of Pelosi's bill, would reap $1.8 billion for the local folks. And that's what we're up against. Well, hey, Godspeed to a fair election here and properly counting every proper vote. We don't know how it's going to turn out. Let's take a worst case fiscal scenario. New administration, change administration. What tactics did the movement learn, giving oversight in the years that conceivably used to get better policy out of a Biden administration?
Well, it's funny you should ask that, because as you were asking the question, I saw my good friend Ravenel Curry just posted a little item saying the most important thing to do is make sure the Democrats don't take control of the Senate, which means, we've got these two really important Senate races. And I know that you're not a political organization, nor is my Committee on Unleashed Prosperity, but we need to alert people to how dangerous, this would be. If you get a Democratic, if the Democrats will win both those seats in Georgia, which I don't think they're going to do. I put the odds at 70% the Republicans win both of them, and or at least one of the two. But let's talk worst case scenario. Think about this, Adam. If the Democrats if you get the murderer's row of Biden in the White House, Pelosi running the House, and Schumer running the Senate, you're going to get a $4 trillion tax increase. It's going to wipe out the tax cut that Larry Kudlow and I helped Trump. You're going to get Washington, D.C. as the 51st state. You're going to get Puerto Rico as the 52nd state. You're going to get an end to the filibuster, which, by the way, is one of the most important protections for minority interests in this country. You're going to get a packing of the Supreme Court. You are going to get a massive blue state bailout. So the stakes are hugely high here, and it's going to be extremely dangerous if that happens. There's a great piece I would refer to people to in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. I'm holding it in my hand right here by our good friend Phil Gramm, the former senator from Texas, who notes that, if Biden wants to be a successful president, he should do what Bill Clinton did and move to the middle. I mean, under Bill Clinton, we did welfare reform. We did the capital gains tax cut. Adam, you'll love this. The biggest reduction in government spending in the last 50 years happened under Bill Clinton, a Democrat. And that's because you had a Republican Congress and they downsized government in a big way. Biden would be smart to do that. I don't think he's capable of. But I am very worried about this possibility of Democrats running the table, because these people are crazy. I mean, they are going to move forward with a massive progressive agenda that will bankrupt this country if they take charge.
Well, at OpenTheBooks.com, Steve, as you know, we are on a war footing. If Trump gets a second term, he gets an. We're going to be aggressive. There's no honeymoon. He gets an F on spending and debt to this point. If it's Joe Biden, we know how to do oversight on the Democratic administration. On the Barack Obama administration, a very impactful report on the EPA. We found that the bureaucrats like high-end expensive furniture. They purchased $100 million of it over at the EPA. We did oversight on the Ivy League colleges and found in a 6-year period they took $42 billion worth of federal contract payments, grants, and all sorts of different subsidies. That actually led to the 2017 tax on their endowment. We did a report on the VA, and we found $20 million worth of high-end over there in a 10-year period. We got that program stopped. So we know how to give oversight definitely to a Democratic administration as well as a Republican.
Adam, let me just interrupt for 1 second and say, we've got to make sure, and I'm putting this on your shoulders, we have to make sure that the Small Business Administration discloses which companies across the country are getting, this $500 billion of PPP money. By the way, Art Laffer and I and Steve Forbes at the very beginning of the crisis, we endorsed a loan program for businesses so they could still, but the operative word there is loan, a loan program that would but the money would be repaid to the taxpayers as a way of making sure that businesses would not go bankrupt. And one of the mistakes that the folks at the White House made and the folks in Congress is they turned a loan program into a grant program. And what happened is once it became a free money, you had every business in America signing up, even if whether they needed the money or not, who's going to pass up free money? And that was a huge mistake. And these businesses that took this free money, Adam, we have to make sure the American people know who got this money. And look, some of my friends took PPP money. We didn't at the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. We would have been eligible for $175,000 of free money from the government. But if you're going to take government money, you're going to disclose to the taxpayers. It has to. If you want to protect your private financial privacy, don't take the money. That's my view.
Amen. And you highlighted that yesterday in your newsletter. It was point number one. We didn't even know that was going on. I guess the NFIB, the small business group across the country, they had filed suit to try to forestall transparency on those PPP loans that actually turn into grants if certain criteria are met. We think it's terrible public policy. People that shouldn't be taking the money, they don't want scrutiny. We highlighted Kanye West with his sneaker company. He claims to be a billionaire. They took up the $5 million worth of money. Francis Ford Coppola for his wine companies. Robert Redford for the Sundance Institute. They all took millions. This made the editorial Wall Street Journal. Look, we need a white hot spotlight on all of it. We mapped on an interactive map the mega loans, any loan between 1 and 10 million. We put it on an interactive. Very popular.
Good.
Steve, if Trump gets a second term, what good policy are they going to push? And if he doesn't, what will we have missed out on?
Well, he is going to get a second term. I don't know if it's going to be in 2020 or 2024, but there will be a second term. I think, let me just say this, I was involved in the campaign at the end and I went to these rallies and I've never seen anything quite like it before, in my 35 years of being in politics. I mean, the love and patriotism that these folks had, people would wait an entire day, sometimes in these chilly, cold, and sometimes rainy days. They would stay out and they'd pick up trucks. I went to one town in Pennsylvania. There was the line of pickup trucks and cars and people with flags, and it was 4 miles long. 4 miles long. It was incredible. So, Trump has really started a movement here of putting America first, and I'm all in favor of that. I don't always agree with everything Donald Trump did, but it was an amazing economic renaissance we've had in this country under Trump. And so, I think we start to ask ourselves, if Trump doesn't win, what happens, to the Republican Party? Who's the leader? I know some of you there on this call are from Florida. I think you've got one of the great governors of all time, and Ron DeSantis. He did an amazing job in the election and keeping Florida both safe and prosperous. And so, there's a lot of talent.
So I'll just talk a little bit about the instincts of the Trump administration in the first 3 years. Look, the budgets he submitted to Congress, and we were happy to be a part of that budget, and it cited twice in February of 2020, which was the president's budget to Congress. We're getting ready to launch a report, hopefully Monday, on improper payments, where last year there was $175 billion that the 20 largest federal agencies admit to that was improperly, mistakenly spent. So for every single workday minute, the bureaucrats admit to improperly spending $1 million a minute. It's $15 billion a month and $500 million a day. It's just absolutely incredible. As Tom Smith says, it's institutionalized incompetence. And it's a very important message right now, because the other side says that the government knows how to do it better than you and I know how to do it, which is just patently false by their own admission. Since 2004, these 20 largest federal agencies admit to $2.3 trillion worth of mistaken and improper payments.
Well, I just like to share two thoughts when, in conclusion here. Medical people look at the lockdown question in terms of the COVID, but the lockdown itself has created a stress pandemic
Yes.
that's far more lethal
Yes.
than the virus itself. And Atlas, this advisor to the president and colleagues, have done a study on that. And you'd be shocked at at what's taking place to not just the health of the economy, but the fiscal and mental health of the country. The federal government has a hotline for people that are disturbed. Calls are up 1,000%. The suicides are up dramatically. Overdoses up dramatically. In Dayton, the prescriptions for antidepressants are up 70%. That's the reason. They've never had a lockdown before in history.
Right.
You don't have any PhDs in economics with lockdowns. I don't teach it. It's a totally new world, and I think it's devastating to every single thing that we hold dear. I just like to be a little bit more optimistic about some things.
Uh-huh.
So Amazon is changing the world because of technology. And transparency, open the books, can change the world because of transparency. We now have the tools to do economically, educate the public on how their dollars are being spent. That didn't exist. You couldn't have that before. I believe transparency is going to be demanded. We just have to keep growing, and we have to be more effective.
Right.
But I'm optimistic that we can educate the public that their dollars are being absolutely wasted irresponsibly.
We're taking strides at OpenTheBooks.com to increase our oversight capacity by 3x as long as things go well with our budget in 2021. We're right there. We are positive. We are hopeful and optimistic. We recognize America is the greatest nation ever conceived in the history of the world. And I recognize the moment that each one of you have given us, that in the last 5,000 years of human history, we all get to live freedom and liberty. We're in to preserve those fundamental underpinnings. Thank you very much for joining us on the call here today. We'll see you back next month. Next month, we're going to have an investor recap of 2020 at OpenTheBooks.com. We hope to see you back.